Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different, a topic you probably won't survive. Medieval blacksmithing. Ever wonder what it was like to be a blacksmith in the Middle Ages? Picture yourself standing in front of a blazing forge, hammer in hand, with sparks flying around you as you pound out weapons, armor, and tools, all while surrounded by molten metal and the constant hum of your environment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, feel free to post your location and local time. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the sweltering heat of a medieval forge. The air is thick, almost suffocating, with the overpowering scent of metal, sweat, and smoke. Your hands are already slick with sweat, and your skin feels hot like it's about to burn any second. The forge crackles and spits out sparks, the red-hot coals glowing fiercely beneath the steel. You're in the middle of an inferno, and it's just the beginning. The life of a blacksmith in medieval times wasn't just about shaping metal. It was about surviving the overwhelming dangers that came with the trade. And believe me, this wasn't your average job. You weren't just bending and twisting metal, you were at war with it. Every time you hammered a piece of iron, you risked injury. Every spark that flew out of the forge, potentially a burn. Each swing of the hammer, a reminder of the brutal physical toll it took on your body. Let's talk about that heat for a second. It's not just the physical burn you'll feel on your arms and face. No, the heat's more insidious than that. It works on your body in strange ways. You can't drink enough to stay hydrated, because it just sweats right out of you. The blacksmith's forge isn't a place for the faint-hearted. The temperature is so intense that working in these conditions for hours on end would drain the life out of even the most resilient. Your lungs burn with every breath of the coal smoke, and your face is constantly bathed in the red-orange glow of the fire. The heat isn't just a physical obstacle, it's a mental one too. You need to be sharp, focused, and determined, even though every inch of your body is telling you to step away from the forge and collapse in a cool corner. But that doesn't happen. There's no time for rest. The work doesn't stop just because the heat gets unbearable. That's what made being a medieval blacksmith so terrifying. The relentless grind of physical labor in a furnace of danger. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths had a higher mortality rate compared to other trades due to the constant exposure to these brutal working conditions. Some say blacksmiths were among the toughest people in medieval society because of what they endured. Others argue that their short lifespan was a direct result of the physical strain, inhaling fumes, and constant exposure to the heat and fire. Imagine standing there, hammer in hand, sweating through your tunic, the heat of the forge blasting your face. You're shaping a blade, and the molten metal is glowing, almost alive. But that's where the real danger lies. You've got to focus on the quality of your work because your livelihood depends on it. Every piece you forge, from swords to plows, has to be precise. A small error could render the product useless or worse, dangerous. Your work isn't just a means of survival for you. It's also for the person who will use what you've crafted, potentially in battle. These weren't the only risks though. Blacksmiths had to be wary of their tools, which, let's face it, weren't exactly the kind of equipment you'd use to do a few delicate projects around the house. The hammer was the main tool, but the anvil, the tongs, and even the bellows were potential sources of injury. The blacksmith's body took a beating daily. The repetitive hammering caused wear and tear on muscles and joints, and the heavy tongs could burn your hands or slice into your skin if not handled properly. But here's where it gets even worse. The constant threat of fire. In a room full of hot, molten metal and flammable materials, the risk of an accidental blaze was always lurking. A misstep, a dropped piece of hot iron, or even a loose spark could set the whole workshop ablaze. These fire accidents were no small matter. Imagine working all day under extreme pressure, just to go home knowing that your livelihood and possibly your life could go up in smoke with the flick of a spark. It was the harsh reality of working with fire, and blacksmiths had to accept this danger if they were to succeed in their craft. And this is where that terrifying reality check kicks in. You probably won't survive this. Seriously, medieval blacksmiths had to face all of these dangers: heat, injury, fire, exhaustion day in and day out, all while knowing that their bodies would wear down over time. It's no wonder they were viewed as some of the toughest members of society. Yet, despite the hardships, they were also revered. They were the backbone of medieval society, providing tools for everything from farming to warfare. Without them, civilization as we know it couldn't have advanced. So, as the heat of the forge burns your skin, as the clang of hammer on metal fills your ears, and as sweat drips down your back, take a moment to appreciate what you're doing. And remember, it's not for the faint of heart. The heat of the forge isn't the only thing that makes being a medieval blacksmith so terrifying. Let's talk about the tools of the trade, those sharp, heavy instruments you used every single day. The hammer, the tongs, the chisels, and of course, the anvil. These weren't just tools, they were extensions of your body. And they were dangerous, very dangerous. Imagine holding a red-hot piece of iron in a set of tongs, lifting it over a blazing fire, and bringing it down onto an anvil. It's a constant dance of precision, strength, and sheer force. A wrong move and you're facing an injury that could sideline you for days, weeks, or even longer. Each tool has a specific purpose, but with that purpose comes an inherent danger. The hammer, for instance, isn't just a simple tool. It's a weapon in your hands. With one wrong swing, the heavy hammer could slip from your grasp and smash into your own body or the tools around you, sending sparks flying and potentially causing a fire. Blacksmiths had to be skilled not only in the art of forging, but also in how to handle these dangerous tools. They didn't have the luxury of modern safety equipment. No gloves or heavy boots to protect themselves. You had to know how to hold the hammer just right, how to angle the tongs, how to strike the metal without it flying off the anvil and landing in the wrong place like your foot. And let's not forget the anvil itself. This heavy steel block was where all the magic happened. It's where the metal was shaped, hammered, and flattened to create tools, weapons, and other essential items. But the anvil wasn't just a flat, passive surface. It could be a danger zone in its own right. Imagine your hand slipping while holding the hammer or the tongs, and the metal you're working with suddenly flying off the anvil, hitting you or even causing a chain reaction of sparks that set your clothes or the workshop on fire. The tongs might not seem dangerous at first glance, but they're a crucial tool in the blacksmith's arsenal. Blacksmiths used tongs to hold hot metal, move it around, and position it on the anvil for hammering. But using tongs with hot metal wasn't as simple as it sounds. The heat of the metal could easily burn through the tongs if the blacksmith wasn't careful. Worse still, if the tongs slipped or you lost your grip, you'd end up with molten metal burning you. And there was no quick fix for that, just a lifetime of scars and injuries. The constant threat of burns was a reality for every blacksmith. Historians still debate how often blacksmiths were injured by their own tools. Some argue that the risk of injury was so high that many blacksmiths would have suffered permanent damage to their hands and arms by the end of their careers. Others suggest that the sheer repetition of blacksmithing work helped them develop the muscle memory needed to avoid injury. But one thing is for sure, it was a dangerous trade, where every single tool you touched had the potential to hurt you in ways you could never have predicted. And it wasn't just about physical injury. The weight of mental strain and stress added another layer to the terror of being a blacksmith. The pressure to forge weapons and armor for battles, tools for everyday survival, or intricate designs for the aristocracy. This was more than just work. It was the kind of pressure that could break a person, especially in such an unforgiving environment. Blacksmiths had to be on alert at all times. Every swing of the hammer, every piece of metal you placed in the fire, was done with precision. Mistakes could cost lives. If you didn't forge a strong enough blade, someone might die on the battlefield because of your error. If you didn't craft a proper plow, the harvest could fail, leading to famine and death for an entire community. There's also the mental toll of the job. While blacksmiths were respected for their craftsmanship and skill, Their job wasn't one that gave them much room for rest or respite. Loneliness was common in the forge. Many blacksmiths worked long hours in dark, windowless shops. They were surrounded by the heat and noise of their work, often isolated from the rest of society. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer, the hiss of the fire, these sounds could become maddening when there was no one around to talk to. No distractions from the constant pressure to keep forging. But the stress didn't stop there. As we know, medieval blacksmiths were essential to the war effort, especially when the medieval world was constantly embroiled in battles. If you were a blacksmith, you might be crafting swords, daggers, and armor for knights, soldiers, and even the royal army. The responsibility of creating weapons of war wasn't just about producing items, it was about creating the tools that would determine life and death on the battlefield. The weight of that responsibility is hard to fathom. How do you deal with the pressure of crafting something that could potentially take someone's life? This connection between blacksmithing and war was terrifying in itself. You weren't just shaping tools and metal, you were shaping instruments of destruction. Historians still argue whether this made the blacksmith's job morally more complex, or if the demand for weapons in medieval society simply made it a necessity. Either way, knowing that your work could be used to harm others added a terrifying dimension to the job that many blacksmiths had to reconcile with their own values. So, as you hammer away at the metal, think of the tools you're wielding and the weight of responsibility that comes with them. The constant danger of the forge, the ever-present risk of injury, and the mental strain of being a craftsman at the crossroads of art and destruction, it's not a job for the faint of heart. Let's dive even deeper into the terrifying aspects of medieval blacksmithing. As if the heat, the tools, and the mental strain weren't enough, blacksmiths also had to contend with the constant risk of burns. While many people today would think of burns as the obvious danger in such a profession, medieval blacksmiths were exposed to multiple kinds of burns, some of which we might not even think about today. Picture this. You've been working on a red-hot piece of metal for hours, shaping it, hammering it, and forging it into the perfect blade. Sweat pours from your brow, and despite the constant heat, you're pushing through. But then whoosh, a spark flies from the forge, catching the sleeve of your tunic. The cloth is instantly ablaze. You might get it out in time, or maybe you'll have to deal with a burnt arm or hand. The second that flame touches your skin, you're facing a burn that could last a lifetime. That wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of daily life in the forge. Not only could you get burned by the molten metal, but also by the sudden bursts of flames that occur in the forge. You might have been hammering away on the anvil when a burst of flame escapes the fire pit. It's a common occurrence that blacksmiths had to deal with the forge constantly throwing out sparks or even shooting out small fires, especially when the fire was stoked too aggressively. The risk of this random fire hazard meant that blacksmiths had to stay alert at all times, always at the ready to put out an unexpected flare. Now, let's talk about the more insidious burns. If you've ever worked with hot metals, you know that sometimes the real danger comes not from a visible flame, but from contact with metal surfaces. Even when you think you've cooled something down, metal can retain heat for hours. A simple accidental touch to a forgotten piece of hot iron or steel could lead to severe burns. In medieval times, blacksmiths didn't have the protective gear we rely on today, like gloves or heat-resistant aprons. So, every time a blacksmith grabbed the wrong part of a tool or failed to spot the glowing edge of a heated metal piece, they risked scalding themselves. The heat wasn't the only factor contributing to burns either. The materials blacksmiths worked with could be just as dangerous. Lead, a commonly used metal in the forge, was toxic, and prolonged exposure to lead fumes could lead to serious health problems, including lead poisoning. But worse still were the arsenic fumes that came from some metal alloys used in forging, such as certain brass or bronze alloys. These materials release toxic gases that, if inhaled or absorbed through the skin, could cause severe illness or even death. Imagine working in an enclosed space all day, breathing in not just smoke and heat, but poisonous fumes, day after day, with no idea that it was slowly damaging your body. Historians still debate whether the long-term effects of such exposure played a role in the relatively short lifespan of many medieval blacksmiths. Some suggest that blacksmiths were particularly vulnerable to a range of ailments caused by the materials they worked with, while others argue that it was simply the toll of the physically demanding job that led to a shorter life expectancy. Regardless, we know that workplace safety as we think of it today didn't exist in medieval times. Blacksmiths had to rely on their instincts and training to minimize the damage. The injuries weren't always immediate either. Over time, the repetitive motions of hammering, lifting, and bending would begin to take their toll. The stress and strain on the body could result in chronic pain and musculoskeletal damage, with some blacksmiths ending their careers with permanently damaged hands or backs. Medieval blacksmiths were effectively trapped in a cycle of continuous work, physical strain, and injury. But there was no alternative. They couldn't afford to stop working. Stopping meant losing customers, missing deadlines, and ultimately jeopardizing their livelihood. So, even when pain became unbearable, the work continued. Workplace accidents were a common occurrence in the blacksmith shop. We've talked about how easy it was for blacksmiths to injure themselves with the tools of the trade, but consider the sheer volume of flying debris that came from working with metal. As the metal was hammered, tiny fragments would break off and fly in all directions. These small shards of hard metal, sparks, and molten drops could land anywhere from the blacksmith's body to the faces of their apprentices or steel workers. Even something as simple as a shard of metal landing in the eye could have severe, permanent consequences. Injuries from flying debris were often invisible and not immediately felt, but could leave blacksmiths with scars or other long-term damage. The mental toll of all this danger was just as important. Every day, a blacksmith walked into their shop knowing they faced physical harm, whether it was burns, cuts, broken bones, or injuries from flying sparks. That constant anxiety wasn't just physical, it wore on the mind too. Being in an environment where danger was an everyday occurrence would make anyone more likely to feel stressed, isolated, and even somewhat paranoid. That constant fear of injury or death would chip away at the mental well-being of the blacksmith over time. Yet, they had no choice but to carry on. The blacksmith was part craftsman, part warrior, facing the forge and its risks every single day, sometimes with the pressure of providing essential goods for an entire community or army. It wasn't just a job, it was a test of endurance, strength, and willpower, where even the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. Now that we've touched on the terrifying physical demands of medieval blacksmithing, let's talk about one of the most mentally taxing aspects of the job, the constant pressure to produce. Imagine this. You've spent hours hammering, sweating, and enduring the scorching heat of the forge, and suddenly, a merchant walks in with a new order. It's urgent, they need weapons, tools, or armor, and they need it now. The pressure to meet these demands is unrelenting, especially in a world where a delay or defect in your work could mean disaster, not just for your reputation, but for the people who depend on your craft. For a medieval blacksmith, there was no taking the day off or catching up tomorrow. Deadlines weren't just about schedules, they were about survival. If a blacksmith couldn't meet an order on time, they risked losing important clients, perhaps even the entire livelihood of their business. In wartime, this pressure was even greater. Blacksmiths were tasked with producing weapons and armor for soldiers, and those items were essential to the success of battles and sieges. One mistake could change the course of a battle, and a faulty blade or poorly crafted helmet might result in the death of a soldier. Knowing that the stakes were this high, the fear of failing was constant. Think about it. The difference between a finely made sword and a poorly crafted one could be the difference between life and death for someone wielding it. The blacksmith, in essence, was crafting not just tools, but the instruments of survival for their community, army, or town. But this intense pressure didn't end with the crafting of weapons. The same urgency applied to making tools for daily life, such as plows, hammers, and nails. The blacksmith was expected to handle it all, in the same environment of heat, danger, and exhaustion. Deadlines weren't just stressful, they were dangerous. The faster a blacksmith worked to meet an order, the greater the chance of injury. Many blacksmiths worked in such chaotic conditions that they had to keep up the pace, not knowing if the very next hammer strike would be the one that injured them or worse, caused an accident that destroyed everything they'd worked for. But if they didn't keep up with the pace, they'd lose their customers to the competition. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths' mental health was impacted by this relentless pressure. Some suggest that blacksmiths were more likely to suffer from stress, anxiety, and burnout due to the constant demands of their work. Others believe that the tough nature of the trade may have acted as a protective factor, making blacksmiths more resilient over time. Regardless, one thing is certain. The constant mental burden added another layer of fear to the terrifying reality of medieval blacksmithing. Let's also consider the mental strain that came with being responsible for the success of battles. As a blacksmith, you weren't just producing everyday tools, you were creating weapons of war. Imagine knowing that the swords, shields, and armor you forged would be sent into the hands of soldiers about to fight on battlefields. Your craft was directly tied to life and death decisions. Was your sword sharp enough? Could your armor withstand the force of a blow? These were questions that haunted blacksmiths daily. A failure in your craft could have grave consequences. Interestingly, historians debate the moral toll that blacksmiths may have experienced. Some argue that the blacksmith was essentially a silent accomplice in warfare, creating tools that would inevitably be used for violence. Others suggest that the blacksmith took pride in their ability to protect soldiers, making weapons that helped secure victories and keep their people safe. In any case, the act of crafting weapons wasn't just about producing a product, it was about bearing witness to the violence those products would later support. It's a heavy psychological burden. Then there was the physical toll of working long hours under stress. Medieval blacksmiths typically worked long days, often 12 to 16 hours in the forge, with no time to rest or recover. Working in such harsh conditions meant that the body never had time to heal from previous injuries, and the muscles and joints would suffer permanent damage over time. It wasn't unusual for blacksmiths to develop conditions like arthritis, carpal tunnel syndrome, or other ailments related to their repetitive work. The constant physical strain on the body combined with the mental strain of deadlines created a toxic combination for the blacksmith's health. The blacksmith's body had to endure a brutal routine hammering for hours on end, lifting heavy metals, bending over the forge, constantly exposed to toxic fumes. While today we have ergonomic tools and health regulations in place, medieval blacksmiths had to simply push through it all. The calluses on their hands weren't just a sign of hard work, they were a sign of survival. The pressure wasn't only about deadlines, it was also about reputation. A blacksmith's reputation in the medieval world was everything. They were highly respected within their communities, and their work was often exhibited in front of local leaders or merchants. If you were a blacksmith in a village, you were likely the only one in town capable of crafting certain tools or weapons. Your skills and craftsmanship defined your reputation, and word of mouth spread quickly. If your metal wasn't strong enough, your forge wouldn't stay open for long. But as with everything in medieval society, the blacksmith's position in the community wasn't all about pride and respect. It came with immense pressure to constantly perform at a high level. The fear of not being able to meet the demands could weigh heavily on a blacksmith's shoulders. That constant pressure, compounded by the dangers of their work environment, turned their craft into a terrifying and high-stakes profession. So, as you stand in the heat of the forge, hammering away at metal, know this. Your work could mean the difference between life and death, not just for yourself, but for the soldiers relying on the weapons you're forging, the farmers needing the tools you're creating, and the community depending on you to keep the wheels of society turning. So, we've talked about the heat, the dangerous tools, and the pressure, but there's another terrifying aspect of being a medieval blacksmith that we have to explore: the physical toll on the body. You're standing there in front of the blazing forge, the hammer in your hand, striking the anvil with all your strength. The heat radiates from the forge, your sweat dripping down your face, your muscles aching from the relentless repetition. You've been working for hours, maybe even days, and your body is starting to feel the strain. The hammer itself wasn't just a tool, it was a weight. It was heavy, designed to help you strike metal with enough force to shape it. But using that hammer day in and day out wasn't easy. Your arms, your back, your legs, all of them had to work in unison to keep up with the constant rhythm of pounding. Each strike, each blow to the anvil, felt like an extension of yourself. It wasn't just your muscles that were at risk, your joints were too. Repetitive motion injuries, like tendinitis, were a common affliction for blacksmiths, and there were no painkillers, no modern therapists to help ease the discomfort. You pushed through the pain because you had no other choice. But it wasn't just the hammering that took its toll. The posture that blacksmiths had to maintain while working in front of the forge was enough to cause permanent damage. Bending over the anvil for hours on end, standing in the heat, and leaning into the forge all day long put immense strain on the spine, shoulders, and neck. Many blacksmiths would end up with spinal deformities or muscle atrophy, and over time, the damage accumulated, shortening their working lives. Historians debate whether blacksmiths had a high rate of permanent injury compared to other trades. Some argue that because the blacksmith was constantly working with their body in a demanding and repetitive way, they were more prone to chronic conditions like arthritis or degenerative disc disease. Others believe that the physical resilience required by blacksmithing may have kept them healthier in the long run by building a strength that made them tougher. Regardless of the debate, it's clear that blacksmiths endured a unique physical burden, kind of daily punishment for the work they did. And speaking of punishment, let's not forget about the heat-induced injuries. It wasn't just the burns from molten metal that posed a danger. It was also the scalding steam that would occasionally burst from the furnace. In a place where you're dealing with temperatures so hot that you can barely breathe, an accidental spill of water into the furnace or a misplaced tool could lead to steam explosions that would leave you severely scalded. The idea of being trapped in such an environment is terrifying. You're essentially stuck there, in a tiny workshop or smithy, with no way to escape the fumes, the heat, the constant noise, or the physical pain of the work. There's no respite, no real place to retreat to for rest. The forge is your world, and it becomes a kind of mental prison that takes a toll on your mind as much as it does on your body. The relentless pressure to perform, the constant physical strain, and the lack of rest led to exhaustion that only worsened the longer a blacksmith worked. It wasn't just about the physical strain either. There was the mental pressure of meeting expectations, especially in medieval times when the blacksmith's reputation meant everything. Imagine the stress of being the one person responsible for crafting the tools that an entire community relies on. If a blacksmith didn't forge a good sword, it could result in the death of a soldier. If they didn't make enough plows, an entire village could go without crops for a season. The weight of the community's survival rested squarely on your shoulders. It's no wonder blacksmiths had a reputation for being resilient. They had no choice but to be strong. But there were other mental strains that came with the job as well. Blacksmiths were often isolated, working alone or with just one or two apprentices, and working in seclusion for long hours, without much social interaction, would have contributed to feelings of loneliness or mental fatigue. Add to that the relentless pressure, the injuries, and the exhaustion, and it's clear that blacksmithing wasn't just a physically demanding trade, it was a mentally taxing one as well. Historians still debate whether blacksmiths were more prone to mental illnesses compared to other medieval workers. While there's no definitive evidence, many argue that the isolation, long hours, and physical toll of the work created an environment ripe for mental strain. Stress, burnout, and depression may have been more prevalent than we realize, especially since mental health was hardly understood or treated in medieval society. Imagine, though, being a blacksmith in a world where pain was normal. You would have had to push through every injury, every setback, every moment of exhaustion, just to meet the needs of your community. The terrifying thing is that despite the constant threat of injury, mental exhaustion, and physical toll, blacksmiths weren't just surviving, they were creating. They were building weapons, crafting tools, and providing for the needs of entire societies, all while battling the conditions that made their work so demanding. Their resilience is nothing short of extraordinary. The blacksmith was not just a craftsman. They were a pillar of society, whose work literally shaped the world around them. Every piece of metal that came from their forge had the potential to change history. But the cost of that contribution was high pain, suffering, and a shortened lifespan were the realities of the job. In our previous section, we explored the unrelenting physical and mental toll of being a medieval blacksmith. But there's another terrifying aspect of their life that can't be overlooked: the constant threat of fire. Working in a space full of open flames, molten metal, and burning coal, blacksmiths were never far from disaster. Even the smallest mistake could turn their workplace into a fiery furnace. Now, imagine it: the glow of the forge, the crackling of burning coal, and the smoke swirling around you as you stand over your anvil, hammer in hand. You're used to the heat. You've grown accustomed to the burn on your skin as you work. But there's always that gnawing fear: what if the fire gets out of hand? What if the coals ignite the room? Or the metal ignites an explosive reaction? It only takes one tiny spark to start a blaze that could destroy everything. Fire was both a tool and a terror in the blacksmith shop. On one hand, it was the source of their power, melting metal, heating the forge, making metal malleable enough to work with. Without fire, a blacksmith couldn't do their job. But on the other hand, fire was a constant danger. In fact, it was more of a threat than any weapon they forged. Medieval forges were basically ticking time bombs, with each misstep increasing the risk of disaster. If a blacksmith wasn't constantly vigilant, the slightest mistake could lead to a catastrophic fire that could burn down the entire workshop, sometimes even the entire village. The fire wasn't just a theoretical risk, it was a reality blacksmiths faced every single day. Blacksmiths worked in confined spaces, surrounded by highly flammable materials like timber, cloth, and dried herbs. The forge itself, typically built out of stone, was constantly exposed to heat and flame. Add to that the molten metal, which could easily spill, and you have a dangerous combination. Even with all the safety measures medieval blacksmiths took, the risk of a blaze was always there. Accidents were common: one slip, one carelessness, and the workshop could go up in flames. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths were able to safeguard their workshops from fire. But given how many shops were destroyed over the centuries, it seems they were always walking a fine line. The physical effects of fire-related injuries were also terrifying. If a blacksmith did get burned, it wasn't just a simple wound. Burns from molten metal or overheated tools could cause severe tissue damage, leading to infection or even loss of limbs. Some blacksmiths suffered from permanent scarring on their faces, arms, or hands from years of exposure to molten metal or flames. But the injuries weren't just about the visible burns, there were internal injuries as well. When molten metal splashed onto a blacksmith's skin, it could create deep, wound-like injuries that could result in long-term trauma and chronic pain. Imagine working every day with the constant threat of being badly burned, knowing that your livelihood depended on you forging metal at extreme temperatures. Every burn wasn't just an injury, it was a potential crippling setback. The work was hazardous for apprentices as well. Many of the younger blacksmiths learned their craft by watching the masters at work, often performing the most dangerous tasks like managing the forge's temperature or holding metal over the fire. Apprentices were constantly at risk of accidents because they hadn't yet developed the skill or intuition needed to anticipate the dangers of their work environment. However, accidents didn't always happen because of lack of experience. Even the most skilled blacksmiths could make a mistake. Many historical records tell of accidental burns and even fatal accidents that resulted from a single mistake in a moment of carelessness. Adding to the fear of fire was the invisibility of certain risks. A blacksmith could be working for hours, forging metal, and yet still face hazards that weren't visible to the naked eye. For example, some materials used in medieval blacksmithing released dangerous fumes that could be toxic when inhaled. The fumes from burning charcoal, for example, were poisonous and could cause carbon monoxide poisoning if the blacksmith wasn't careful about ventilation. Historians argue whether medieval blacksmiths understood the dangers of these fumes. Some believe they did, while others suggest that it wasn't until modern times that the toxic nature of some of the gases they breathed became fully understood. Regardless, blacksmiths worked in such a dangerous environment that the risk of poisoning was a very real concern for them. But let's take a moment to talk about the mental toll that living with these dangers would have had on a blacksmith. Imagine your day-to-day life filled with the tension of potentially catastrophic accidents. You can't afford to relax or let your guard down, not for one moment. That's a huge amount of pressure. Every swing of the hammer, every touch of molten metal, every decision you make while handling fire could have lasting consequences. The anxiety of being a blacksmith wasn't just about physical injury, it was about the constant fear of accidents. You couldn't escape it, no matter how skilled or experienced you were. This constant state of alertness would have taken a toll on a blacksmith's mental health. The pressure of maintaining focus all day, every day, combined with the fear of fire and injury, would lead to stress and fatigue. The blacksmith's life wasn't just physically demanding, it was mentally exhausting. Every day, they faced the same terrifying dangers, which would have caused emotional strain over time. While the blacksmith was a respected figure in society, their mental and emotional health wasn't taken into account. Historians debate whether these psychological stresses contributed to the relatively short lifespan of medieval blacksmiths. Some believe the constant stress and exposure to dangerous conditions may have shortened their lives. Others argue that their physical resilience might have helped them manage the stress better than we think. In either case, it's clear that blacksmiths faced terrifying mental and physical challenges that went beyond what most people had to endure in medieval times. So, while we can marvel at the skill and resilience of the medieval blacksmith, we can't forget the terrifying reality they lived through every single day: the heat, the fire, the tools, and the constant fear of injury or death. It's hard to imagine how anyone could handle such a relentless, dangerous life. But somehow they did, and without them, society as we know it might not have existed. Now that we've explored the terrifying physical and mental toll of medieval blacksmithing, let's focus on something else that made this trade even more dangerous: the constant exposure to toxic materials. You might think that working in a forge would be dangerous enough with all the fire and molten metal, but blacksmiths also had to deal with materials that were not only physically dangerous, but also poisonous. Let's talk about lead, a common metal used in medieval blacksmithing. Lead was often used to create alloys, especially in tools or weapons, because it was easy to melt and mold. But while it was useful, it was also deadly. Inhalation of lead fumes during the forging process could result in lead poisoning, which could cause everything from headaches and nausea to long-term brain damage or death. The worst part, blacksmiths likely had no idea just how dangerous lead fumes were back then. Lead poisoning was a silent killer, and medieval blacksmiths would have been unaware that they were exposing themselves to it every day, simply by working with the metal. The danger wasn't just from the material itself, but from the dust and fumes that spread throughout the workshop. Imagine working day after day in a space full of lead dust and other toxic materials, not knowing that each breath you took could be slowly poisoning you. The long-term effects would not show up immediately, but as time passed, blacksmiths could develop all sorts of health issues, and their quality of life would deteriorate rapidly. Many blacksmiths likely suffered from symptoms of lead poisoning that were dismissed as something else: chronic fatigue, joint pain, headaches, until they eventually succumbed to the more serious effects of exposure. But lead wasn't the only toxic material blacksmiths had to contend with. Another common material used in medieval forges was arsenic, which was present in some of the alloys used for making weapons and armor. Arsenic is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure can lead to respiratory issues, organ failure, and eventually death. The problem with arsenic is that it was present in many forms. It could be found in the metal itself, in the smoke from the forge, and in the dust. Again, blacksmiths likely had no clue that their everyday work was making them sick. Historians still argue about the extent to which blacksmiths understood the dangers of working with toxic materials. Some suggest that blacksmiths were aware of the risks but simply couldn't avoid them after all. Their livelihood depended on their ability to forge metal, and the dangers were just part of the job. Others argue that blacksmiths were likely ignorant of the dangers they were facing, simply because medieval society didn't have the knowledge or vocabulary to understand toxicity the way we do today. Regardless of what they knew, the facts are clear. Blacksmiths were regularly exposed to harmful chemicals, and the effects were devastating. But the toxic materials didn't just affect the blacksmiths themselves. The apprentices and other workers in the shop were exposed as well. Imagine being a young apprentice, learning the trade in a cramped, poorly ventilated workshop filled with toxic fumes. The very nature of the work made long-term health damage almost inevitable. In addition to lead and arsenic, medieval blacksmiths were also exposed to other dangerous chemicals, such as coal dust from the furnaces and forges. Coal dust can cause respiratory issues over time, leading to conditions like black lung disease or chronic bronchitis. The constant inhalation of coal dust would have made it hard for blacksmiths to breathe, and over time, they could develop a chronic cough, fatigue, and other serious respiratory problems. Much like lead poisoning, the damage wasn't immediate. It accumulated over years of exposure, leading to premature death. It's mind-boggling to think about the level of exposure to harmful substances that blacksmiths faced in their everyday work. While we often hear about the visible dangers like burns or injuries from tools, the toxic risks were invisible and insidious. You could be working in the forge, breathing in fumes, and not even realize that it was slowly damaging your lungs or poisoning you. It's as if they were working with one hand tied behind their back, constantly fighting an invisible enemy. As if the toxic fumes weren't enough, blacksmiths also had to worry about the physical toll that these materials took on their immune system. Constant exposure to the heat, the toxins, and the physical strain of the work weakened their bodies, making them more vulnerable to illnesses. It wasn't uncommon for blacksmiths to contract infections from burns or cuts, but when you're working in a shop full of metal and dust, it becomes a lot easier for bacteria and viruses to spread. And we haven't even touched on the mental impact of knowing that every day you worked, you were possibly shortening your life due to the very materials you were handling. Think about it, being fully aware that the forge you work in could poison you, but having no real alternative to make a living. It was a terrifying existence, especially considering how little help there was for blacksmiths in medieval times. There were no hospitals, no modern medical treatments, and definitely no doctors who understood the dangers of lead poisoning, arsenic exposure, or coal dust. Blacksmiths were truly on their own when it came to health and safety. The exposure to dangerous materials was just one more reason why being a medieval blacksmith was a terrifying profession. Working in a forge wasn't just about the fire and the metal, it was about constant danger that came from all directions. The risks were ever present, and the consequences of not being careful could be fatal. Now that we've covered the toxic materials, the physical strain, and the ever-present fire hazards, let's talk about the mental and emotional toll that being a medieval blacksmith could take. It's not just the burns or the fumes that made this profession terrifying. The constant pressure of working in such high-stakes conditions, coupled with the isolation of the job, added a whole new layer of difficulty to the craft. Picture yourself as a blacksmith back in medieval times. You're not only facing the physical risks, but you're also isolated in a noisy, sweltering workshop, working long hours. The rhythmic pounding of your hammer on the anvil, the hiss of steam rising from molten metal, those sounds would become part of your world. But in this harsh, relentless environment, you'd find little emotional support. Blacksmiths, unlike many other tradespeople, often worked alone or with one or two apprentices, making it a solitary existence. The mental strain of this job was immense. Imagine spending hours or even days crafting a weapon or piece of armor, knowing that it had to be perfect. A single mistake had led to a ruined product and a lost order, which meant financial ruin. Or worse, your work might be used in a battle, and if it failed, people could die. You are not just creating tools or decorative items, you are crafting instruments of life and death. The weight of that responsibility would hang heavy on any blacksmith's shoulders. The mental toll didn't stop there. Many medieval blacksmiths faced the additional pressure of having to meet demanding customers, often under difficult circumstances. The job wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about managing stressful relationships with customers who had high expectations and wouldn't hesitate to take their business elsewhere if you failed to meet their needs. If you were crafting swords for a knight or armor for an army, you knew that one misstep could cost you not just a reputation, but the respect of the entire community. The pressure to constantly perform and deliver quality work was immense, and it didn't leave much room for mental breaks. Add to that the fact that blacksmiths were often working in dimly lit, poorly ventilated workshops, places that were hot, dirty, and often cramped, and it becomes clear that the job wasn't just taxing on the body, but on the mind too. The darkness, combined with the endless noise, fumes, and heat, could make it difficult to maintain focus, leading to mental fatigue. It wasn't uncommon for blacksmiths to become burned out after years of working under these conditions, and mental health was rarely a consideration in medieval times. You also had to deal with the lack of social interaction. As a blacksmith, you might spend long hours alone in your shop, isolated from the outside world. This social isolation could take a significant toll on a blacksmith's mental well-being. In a world without modern communications or entertainment, the long, silent hours of work could feel overwhelming, even lonely. The constant hum of the forge, the repetitive motions of hammering and shaping metal, became a kind of mental imprisonment, one that you could never truly escape. You were consumed by your work, with little to distract you from the intensity of the task at hand. But it wasn't just loneliness. Pressure from society also played a role. Blacksmiths were deeply respected in medieval society, but that respect came with the expectation of producing high-quality work. Failure to meet those standards was unthinkable. If you didn't meet the needs of your customers, your reputation would suffer, and so would your livelihood. Your success was tied to your ability to withstand these pressures, something that many blacksmiths struggled with throughout their careers. Historians debate whether blacksmiths were more likely to experience mental health issues compared to other medieval workers. Some believe that the unique demands of the job combined with the physical and emotional strain would have made blacksmiths more vulnerable to conditions like depression, anxiety, or even burnout. Others suggest that the blacksmith's resilience to physical pain might have made them mentally tougher, better able to withstand the constant stresses of their trade. But regardless of the exact cause, the reality is clear. Blacksmiths had to endure both mental and physical hardships on a daily basis, creating a dangerous environment for both the body and mind. Let's not forget the additional strain caused by working with dangerous materials under these grueling conditions. The threat of injury or death was never far away, and knowing that your work could cause harm or death added a whole new level of stress. Every hammer strike wasn't just about shaping metal, it was about being responsible for the potential consequences of what you created. The weight of that responsibility was often a heavy burden to bear, and on top of everything else, medieval blacksmiths didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences. There were no tools designed to reduce physical strain or improve efficiency. No power hammers, no electric forges, no high-tech ventilation systems. Everything was done by hand, with manual labor and intense focus. The tools were heavy, the work was exhausting, and the environment was unforgiving. And it was in these conditions that blacksmiths produced some of the most essential items for society: tools, weapons, armor products that could mean life or death. As you stand in the forge, hammering away, imagine the mental and physical exhaustion building up, the pressure, the isolation, and the danger. It was a terrifying life for anyone to lead. Yet blacksmiths didn't have the luxury of giving up. They had to push through day after day, shaping the world with their hands, despite the terrifying toll it took on their bodies and minds. And they did it all while knowing that each swing of the hammer brought them one step closer to the inevitable consequences of their work. So far, we've looked at the terrifying physical and mental toll of being a medieval blacksmith: the heat, the burns, the toxic materials, the pressure to perform. and the constant danger. But there's another terrifying element that made blacksmithing even more challenging: the constant battle with time. Being a blacksmith wasn't just about creating perfect weapons and tools, it was about doing it quickly and under pressure. Time was a commodity you simply didn't have in medieval society. Let's step back for a second. Imagine you're a blacksmith in a medieval village. You're the go-to person for everything from swords and shields to plows and hoes. Your community depends on you, and you know that if you fail to deliver, there's no backup. Every day, you face a constant backlog of work. Not only do you have to finish whatever tools and weapons are needed for the day, but there's always a new order waiting: a sword for a noble, a set of tools for a farmer, or armor for a soldier. And the clock's ticking. You've got no choice but to work as fast as possible. It's easy to forget just how much time pressure played a role in blacksmithing. We tend to imagine the profession in romantic terms, creating beautifully crafted swords or intricate armor. But the reality was a little different. A blacksmith didn't have the luxury of spending days perfecting each piece. You had to make decisions quickly, balance quality with speed, and find ways to streamline your process without cutting corners. And remember, there was no modern technology to speed things up. Blacksmiths used manual labor to shape metal, which was slow, exhausting, and required constant effort. That's why time pressure was a constant companion they needed to meet demands without letting their physical toll or the forge's danger get in the way. Now, let's talk about military campaigns. Medieval blacksmiths were often called on to produce weapons and armor for armies preparing for battle. And this added a whole new level of time pressure. Imagine that a king needs 500 swords for an army on short notice, or a group of knights demands custom-made armor just before going off to fight. You don't have the luxury of weeks or months to get it done. You need to forge them right now. The pressure to deliver on time could make even the most seasoned blacksmith anxious. There was no room for error. Every item you forged had to be perfect because lives were on the line. Blacksmiths were often under this kind of extreme pressure during wartime, and the consequences of failing were severe not just for the blacksmith, but for the entire army. A weapon or piece of armor that wasn't up to standard could lead to death or injury in battle. Historians still argue about whether blacksmiths felt an overwhelming sense of duty during these times, or whether the pressure was so great that it caused them to cut corners or risk accidents to meet the demand. In any case, it's clear that the job of a blacksmith wasn't just physically taxing, it was mentally demanding, with constant anxiety over whether the next piece of work could be completed in time. As we talk about the passage of time, we also have to recognize how life outside the forge impacted the blacksmith. The blacksmith wasn't just concerned with meeting orders, he had a family to provide for, a household to support, and a community that depended on him. The pressure to make ends meet was ever present. It wasn't just about being the best craftsman often. It was about staying alive and keeping food on the table. The blacksmith's family might have helped out in small ways, but in many cases, the burden of work fell squarely on the blacksmith's shoulders. If an order was missed, or a blade was faulty, the whole family's livelihood could be threatened. Time pressure was a factor even in the social aspect of blacksmithing. Imagine being the only blacksmith in a village. You're responsible for producing tools, weapons, and farming implements, and everyone in town knows that you're the one to turn to for repairs and requests. And people from nearby towns and villages would come for their own needs. And with the growing population in medieval towns, the blacksmith shop became a hub of activity. There was no time to rest, no time to stop and reflect on the work you were doing. You were always chasing the clock. But time didn't just work against you as a blacksmith. It also worked against the tools themselves. Medieval tools had a limited lifespan. They wore down with constant use, and the blacksmith was tasked with not only creating new items, but also repairing or sharpening old ones. This was an ongoing process, adding to the workload. And remember, there was no modern mechanical equipment to help ease the workload. It was all manual work: grinding, hammering, shaping, and that took time. But the blacksmith had to keep moving, keep forging, even when the work felt endless. This constant race against time was a terrifying part of the blacksmith's life. If the work wasn't completed on time, there could be consequences. Business could be lost, clients could go elsewhere, and in times of war, lives could be lost. And all the while, the blacksmith was surrounded by the dangers of the forge, fire, heat, toxic fumes, and the risk of injury. Time pressure and constant danger made this one of the most terrifying jobs in medieval times. Historians still argue about how blacksmiths managed to keep up with this constant pressure. Some believe they were able to develop effective systems for managing their work, while others argue that blacksmithing was simply a matter of brute force and endurance. One thing is for sure though, being a blacksmith wasn't just a job, it was a relentless test of both physical and mental stamina. By now, we've looked at the heat, the pressure, the toxins, and the unrelenting pace that made medieval blacksmithing one of the most terrifying jobs of the era. But the terror didn't end there. The threat of physical injury was always lingering over the blacksmith's head. While most people think of blacksmiths as tough, resilient individuals who could handle anything, the truth is far more chilling. Every swing of the hammer, every piece of metal, every swing of a hot iron bar held the potential for injury. Let's start with the sharp edges of the metal. It may sound simple, but one of the most common injuries for blacksmiths was being cut by the very metal they worked with. The blacksmith had to shape and bend iron and steel into various forms, but often the edges were sharp. After hours of intense work, fatigue could set in, and a small mistake, a careless touch, an accidental slip could result in a deep cut that left permanent damage. Think about it. You're holding a hot, jagged piece of metal, your hand trembling slightly from hours of use, and in a single moment, you could end up with a nasty cut that requires stitches or worse, something that could lead to infection. In the medieval period, medical care wasn't what we have today. There were no antiseptics, no clean bandages, and no antibiotics. A simple cut could turn into something far worse if it wasn't treated right away. Many blacksmiths ended up with serious infections, and some even lost fingers or hands to untreated wounds. If the injury was bad enough, it could end a blacksmith's career completely, cutting them off from their livelihood. But cuts weren't the only risk. Blunt force trauma was another horrifying reality of blacksmithing. When you're hammering metal on an anvil for hours, you're swinging a heavy tool repeatedly. If the hammer slipped, or if you missed your target, you could accidentally smash your fingers, hands, or even your legs. The weight and force of the hammer could crush bones, causing permanent disability. Many blacksmiths worked with broken hands or fingers, never getting the chance to heal properly. And because they relied on their hands and arms for their livelihood, these injuries were devastating. Imagine trying to continue working after shattering a finger or breaking a wrist. Every movement would send waves of pain through your body. But you had no choice but to carry on. The danger of flying metal was another terrifying aspect of the blacksmith's work. As the blacksmith hammered away at the metal, small shards, sparks, and pieces of debris would be sent flying into the air. Some of these tiny bits of metal were so hot that they could easily burn the skin, causing second or third degree burns. In the chaos of the forge, with all the noise, heat, and focus on the work at hand, it was easy to miss these flying hazards. A small piece of hot metal could land in your eye or burn a sensitive area of your body, resulting in excruciating pain or long-lasting injuries. There was no escape from it. You were always at risk of being injured, no matter how much skill you had. Then, we need to talk about the potential for catastrophic accidents. A blacksmith shop was filled with dangerous materials, sharp tools, heavy objects, and, of course, fire. If something went wrong, a spark from the forge, an ill-placed hammer, or a dropped tool, it could lead to a disaster. The forge could catch fire, or the metal could explode if the temperature wasn't controlled properly. A huge accident like this could cause serious burns or injury, and in the worst-case scenario, it could be fatal. Then there was the weight of responsibility that added another layer of fear to the blacksmith's daily existence. As we've seen before, the blacksmith was responsible for creating weapons for soldiers or knights who were about to fight in battle. If a sword broke in the middle of a fight, or if armor failed, someone could die because of the blacksmith's mistake. The pressure was immense. and the possibility that your work could directly contribute to the death of a person added a whole new level of psychological burden. The blacksmith had to be perfect every time without fail. There was no room for error. Historians still debate how much fear and anxiety blacksmiths experienced in their daily work. Some suggest that blacksmiths were used to the danger and learned to accept it as a normal part of the job. They became resilient like warriors facing battle every day. They knew the risks and learned to live with them. Others believed that the constant danger of injury, coupled with the mental and emotional strain, made blacksmithing one of the most mentally taxing jobs in medieval society. Even though blacksmiths were regarded as essential to society, their work was fraught with risk. No amount of skill or experience could fully protect them from the dangers of their craft. The act of forging wasn't just about creating beautiful, functional pieces of metal. It was about surviving in an environment filled with constant threats: the heat, the sharp tools, the toxic materials, and the looming spectre of accidents. The blacksmiths who did survive often did so at the cost of their health, their sanity, and their bodies. In many ways, blacksmithing was a battle of endurance, a test of physical and mental strength that required you to keep going, no matter the cost. The job demanded you push past fear, pain, and injury, constantly balancing the art of craftsmanship with the terror of the forge. By now, you've learned about the risks, pressures, and dangers of being a medieval blacksmith. But one aspect we haven't fully explored yet is perhaps one of the most harrowing: the constant threat of losing your livelihood. Medieval blacksmiths were often their community's lifeline for not just weapons, but for tools necessary to build, farm, and survive. But what happens when your forge is destroyed, your tools are damaged, or worst case scenario, your entire shop is consumed by fire? A blacksmith's livelihood was not just their job. It was their entire life. The economic pressure to constantly maintain the forge, keep up with orders, and meet the demands of an ever-changing market was an ever-present fear for blacksmiths. In medieval times, blacksmiths didn't have the safety net of modern financial systems. There were no insurance policies or savings accounts. If a blacksmith's forge burned down, it wasn't just a small setback, it could be the end of their entire career. The very materials they worked with, such as coal and iron, were highly flammable, and the forge itself was a constant fire hazard. And it wasn't just the forge that could be lost. Blacksmiths also needed tools, and those tools were expensive to replace. If your hammer broke or your anvil cracked, it wasn't as simple as buying a new one from a store. You had to forge the tools yourself, and if your shop was already struggling, losing one essential tool could derail your entire operation. Without the proper tools, your ability to work was crippled, and there wasn't much hope for recovery. The economic stress didn't just stem from the tools, it came from the need to keep customers satisfied. Blacksmiths were responsible for making critical items people relied on: swords, tools, plows. Failure meant losing reputation and income. A single dissatisfied customer could spread word of a poor quality product, which could cause a snowball effect. No one wants to buy a sword that might break in battle, and no one wants a plow that will fail when it's time to plant crops. Losing customers meant a loss of income, and in medieval times, losing income could mean losing everything. The reality of bankruptcy wasn't just about losing money, it was about losing your entire status and place in society. Blacksmiths were highly regarded, but their livelihoods were precariously tied to their reputation and productivity. Failure meant ostracism or exile, with no social safety net to catch them. Moreover, blacksmiths didn't work in isolation. They often had apprentices and families to support. The pressure to provide for the next generation, to train apprentices and pass on the craft, added another layer of responsibility. If the shop failed, it wasn't just their own well-being at risk, but their entire family and community. The apprentice depended on the blacksmith for livelihood and training. Losing the business meant losing the apprentice's career too. Many blacksmiths worked in small villages where losing one blacksmith could affect the entire community's economy, increasing vulnerability to invasion, famine, or disasters. On top of this, blacksmiths had to contend with competition. In larger cities, other blacksmiths competed for customers. Competition meant maintaining an edge. offering lower prices or working faster, risking lower quality or damaged reputation. This balancing act put enormous stress on blacksmiths. Historians still debate whether blacksmiths built stable businesses or lived in constant economic uncertainty. Some believe skilled blacksmiths maintained strong reputations and customer flow. Others say most faced ongoing financial struggles. In the end, blacksmithing wasn't just a job, it was a high-risk endeavor. The fear of losing livelihood, reputation, and place in society made blacksmithing terrifying. Yet, despite all risks, blacksmiths persevered, crafting weapons, tools, and armor that shaped the medieval world. As we continue to unravel the terrifying life of a medieval blacksmith, let's focus on the environment in which they worked, an environment so extreme and dangerous that it could have made even the toughest person quiver. The forge, with its intense heat, the constant noise, and the ever-present threat of injury, was a place where blacksmiths didn't just work, they survived. The forge itself was the heart of the blacksmith's world. It was a fiery, chaotic space where metal came to life, transforming from raw, solid ore into functional tools and weapons. But while the forge was where the magic happened, it was also a deadly place. Imagine the heat. The temperature inside a forge could reach over 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, making it an environment so scorching that just being close to the flames could cause heat stroke. Standing near the forge for hours on end, day after day, meant you were constantly exposed to exhausting heat that drained your energy. Even the most resilient blacksmiths couldn't escape the exhaustion that came from working in such extreme conditions. On top of the heat, there was the noise, the constant ringing of the hammer on the anvil, the crackling of the fire, the sound of molten metal splashing onto the ground. It was deafening. The sheer noise of the forge could wear you down mentally as much as the heat wore you down physically. And let's not forget about the dangerous fumes. The forge wasn't just full of smoke from the fire, it also released poisonous gases, including carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, which could cause dizziness, headaches, and in extreme cases, death. Blacksmiths had to breathe in these fumes every day, and there was little they could do to protect themselves. And let's talk about the physical space of the blacksmith's workshop. It wasn't some neat, tidy place where everything was in its place. Medieval blacksmiths worked in cramped, cluttered spaces, often with barely enough room to swing their hammer, let alone move around freely. These workshops, made mostly of stone or wood, were filled with tools, metal scraps, and unfinished products, all jumbled together in a chaotic, sometimes hazardous environment. There was no ergonomics in the medieval world, no cushioned chairs or adjustable tools. Blacksmiths had to bend and stretch in awkward positions for long hours, which often led to injuries like back pain or muscle strains. The space itself was a constant obstacle to their efficiency, and the lack of ventilation meant they were always working in conditions that increased the risk of accidents. But the terrifying thing wasn't just the physical danger of the forge, it was also the psychological toll of working in such an environment. Imagine waking up every day to face the noise, the heat, the fumes, and the pressure of meeting demands. The blacksmith didn't just work for themselves. They worked for the entire community. Every piece of metal they forged, whether it was a sword for a knight, a plough for a farmer, or a tool for a tradesman, was essential for someone's livelihood or survival. Lives were literally in your hands. There was no room for error. A poorly made sword could lead to the death of a soldier in battle, and a defective plough could ruin an entire harvest. The pressure of knowing that your work could result in life or death decisions was enough to drive anyone to the edge. What's even more frightening is that, for all these dangers, blacksmiths were often working alone or with just a single apprentice to help. In small towns and villages, it wasn't uncommon for blacksmiths to be the only craftsmen in the area. That meant that if they didn't show up for work, the entire village would be left without essential tools or weapons. There was no backup, no one to share the workload. And if the blacksmith got sick, injured, or burned, there was no one to take over. The responsibility of the entire community's metal needs rested solely on their shoulders. The sheer solitude of this responsibility must have been both terrifying and overwhelming. Now, imagine that pressure compounded by the uncertainty of medieval life. Wars could break out at any moment, and when they did, the demand for weapons would skyrocket. The blacksmith was expected to produce swords, armor, and tools on a short timeline, often with little regard for the toll the work took on their body or mind. Blacksmiths had to work quickly, under high pressure, and without any modern technology to speed up their processes. And if they failed to meet the demand, they risked losing everything: their reputation, their business, and their livelihood. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths were more vulnerable to mental health issues than other medieval workers. While we don't have concrete evidence of how blacksmiths dealt with the immense stress and isolation of their work, we do know that many faced long-term health issues, not just physical, but mental too. The constant threat of injury, the isolation of their workshops, and the pressure to perform would have taken a significant toll on their psychological well-being. And considering the lack of medical care or support in medieval times, mental health was rarely addressed. It's hard to imagine just how terrifying life must have been for a medieval blacksmith. But what makes their story even more incredible is that despite all these dangers and challenges, they kept forging ahead day after day, year after year. They weren't just crafting metal, they were creating history, shaping the future of warfare, farming, and trade with every piece they produced. The blacksmith was a central figure in medieval society, yet their lives were full of dangers and pressures most people could hardly fathom. Their work was dangerous, physically demanding, and emotionally taxing, but without their contributions, the medieval world would have been a very different place. So far, we've painted a pretty grim picture of the medieval blacksmith's life, haven't we? The heat, the physical toll, the toxic fumes, the pressure, and the constant fear of injury. But as terrifying as all of this sounds, let's step back for a moment and think about something truly remarkable about blacksmithing: the skills and craftsmanship involved. Despite the dangers, blacksmiths were artists in their own right, shaping metal into tools, weapons, and armor with a level of precision and ingenuity that was nothing short of astonishing. But to be a blacksmith was not just about crafting objects, it was about shaping history itself. Medieval blacksmiths were responsible for forging the very tools that allowed societies to function. From farming tools to weapons of war, the blacksmith's work was integral to everyday life. You could say that their work was the backbone of medieval society. But while the role of the blacksmith in medieval life was essential, it was also extraordinarily difficult. The craftsmanship of medieval blacksmithing was a deeply respected skill, passed down through generations. A blacksmith wasn't just someone who knew how to swing a hammer and heat up metal, no. They were masters of their trade, trained for years as apprentices before they could even begin to forge their own work. They had to learn the subtle art of knowing exactly when the metal was the right temperature, how much force to apply with each strike, and how to properly shape the metal without weakening it. Every forging stroke was critical. Too much force, and the metal could shatter. Too little, and the shape wouldn't hold. Historians often debate whether blacksmithing was an art or a trade. Some argue that the creation of weapons and armor, in particular, was more art than function, requiring an artistic vision and creativity. Take the sword, for example. A sword wasn't just a tool for battle, it was often a work of art. Some swords were elaborately decorated with intricate designs etched into the blade or hilt. And these weapons were not just about killing, they were about status, symbolism, and honor. The blacksmith's work was woven into the very fabric of medieval culture. But no matter how artistic the work was, it still had to be functional. A sword that looked beautiful but broke in battle was a failure. A piece of armor that couldn't protect the wearer would be useless. The balance between aesthetics and utility was another challenge blacksmiths had to master. When it came to tools, blacksmiths also had to forge a wide variety of implements, from plows that allowed medieval farmers to till the soil to hammers, chisels, and saws that were needed by tradesmen. Blacksmiths were the ones responsible for keeping society functioning. The quality of these tools was essential for the success of both farming and craftsmanship. A bad plow meant crop failure, and a poorly made tool could mean a botched job for a carpenter or mason. The pressure to produce quality tools was a constant weight on a blacksmith's shoulders, but it was also a matter of pride for them. But the work was not always glamorous. The day-to-day grind of being a blacksmith was filled with repetition. Imagine creating the same tools over and over again, forging the same types of swords, knives, and nails. This repetitive work could get incredibly monotonous, especially when paired with the constant pressure to meet deadlines and customer demands. While some blacksmiths found joy in their craft, others likely felt the mental fatigue of doing the same work day after day. The tedious nature of the work combined with the physical demands of the job created a sense of grueling labor. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths enjoyed the repetitive nature of their work or whether they felt it was a necessary evil of the job. Some suggest that the steady work provided a sense of security, knowing that they were always in demand. Others argue that blacksmiths were trapped by their craft, doing the same repetitive tasks because it was the only skill they knew. Whether it was a sense of pride in craftsmanship or simply the necessity of survival, blacksmiths had to find meaning in their labor. One thing is certain, though their work was essential. Without blacksmiths, medieval societies would have struggled to function. No swords, no armor, no plows, no tools to repair the ever-growing needs of society. Blacksmiths were the unsung heroes who kept the machinery of medieval life running. Historians still argue about the exact status of the medieval blacksmith in society. Were they respected masters of their craft, revered for their skills, or were they just seen as another laborer in the medieval pecking order? It's clear that the blacksmith status was likely tied to their skill level and reputation within the community, but respect for their work was often mixed with the fear of the dangers involved. In either case, the medieval blacksmith's legacy is undeniable. They were the backbone of medieval society, and without their extraordinary craft, the medieval world wouldn't have been able to function. Now that we've explored the skills, the dangers, and the pressures of being a medieval blacksmith, let's turn to something even more terrifying: the idea that blacksmiths were often seen as mysterious, almost magical figures in their communities. In medieval society, craftsmen like blacksmiths were often regarded as figures who had unseen powers because they could manipulate the very elements of nature: earth, fire, and metal. Blacksmithing wasn't just a job, it was an art, a mystical craft, and the blacksmith was viewed as someone who held secrets that common folk couldn't fathom. In many medieval cultures, blacksmiths were believed to have a special connection to the forces of nature, particularly fire. Fire, after all, was the heart of the forge, the thing that allowed metal to transform from something cold and unyielding into something malleable and powerful. Because of this, blacksmiths were often associated with magic, alchemical processes, and even supernatural powers. This connection between blacksmithing and magic is still evident in folklore and legends. In many cultures, blacksmiths were often depicted as wise, mystical figures, capable of crafting enchanted weapons or creating magical artifacts. Think of the legends of Thor's hammer, Excalibur, and the Sword of Destiny. All of these legendary weapons were the products of skilled blacksmiths. Even the word smith is rooted in ancient terms for craft and creation, often linked to the gods or mythical figures. In Norse mythology, the gods themselves relied on blacksmiths to create powerful tools and weapons. And in many medieval myths, blacksmiths were portrayed as agents of fate, able to forge not just weapons but entire destinies. But the idea of the blacksmith as a magical figure was not just rooted in mythology, it was also very much present in the real world of medieval communities. Blacksmiths were widely believed to have a special power over fire, and some even performed rituals to ensure the safety of their workshops. For instance, it was common for blacksmiths to have charms or talismans to protect their work and their forges from dangerous fires. They might also carry certain superstitions, such as never starting a forge on a Friday, which was thought to bring bad luck. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval blacksmiths were actually seen as mystics or magicians by the general public. Some suggest that these beliefs were rooted in the blacksmith's knowledge of alchemy and metallurgy, both of which seemed mysterious to the common folk. After all, blacksmiths were often among the few people who understood the science of fire and metalworking, knowledge that was inaccessible to most people. However, others argue that the idea of the blacksmith as a magical figure was simply a cultural overlay way for medieval societies to make sense of the blacksmith's mysterious power over the elements, but without any real understanding of the craft. Regardless of the extent of these beliefs, what is clear is that the blacksmith's profession was surrounded by awe and fear. The forge was a place where the laws of nature seemed to bend, and the blacksmith was seen as someone who could manipulate those laws. The fire that powered the forge was a force of creation, but it was also a force of destruction. Just as the blacksmith could shape and transform metal, so too could they be seen as having the ability to shape or destroy the world around them. On top of this mystical reputation, blacksmiths were also responsible for creating weapons for warfare weapons that could be used to bring about death and destruction. Swords, spears, and axes weren't just tools. They were instruments of power and control, and the blacksmith was the one who wielded that power. This dual role of being both a creator of life and a harbinger of death gave blacksmiths an almost godlike status. They could create something as beautiful as a fine blade, but that same blade could be used to end a life in battle. This duality made the blacksmith's craft both awe-inspiring and terrifying. While this mystical side of blacksmithing was deeply ingrained in medieval culture, it also created a psychological burden for the blacksmith. To be seen as both a healer and a destroyer could be overwhelming. The weight of responsibility was immense. Blacksmiths weren't just making tools, they were shaping the fate of those who wielded them. When a knight rode into battle with a sword forged by a blacksmith, the very outcome of that battle could hinge on the quality of that weapon. The blacksmith had to carry the burden of knowing that their work could lead to life or death. Historians still argue about the degree to which medieval blacksmiths were aware of their mystical status. Did they truly believe they had a connection to the supernatural? Or was it just a convenient narrative spun by their communities? In either case, what's clear is that blacksmithing was much more than just a craft. It was a powerful force that shaped not only the physical world, but the psychological landscape of medieval society. As we delve deeper into the medieval blacksmith's life, it's time to explore another harrowing aspect of the trade, the relationship between blacksmiths and the law, and the constant fear of punishment. You might not immediately think of law enforcement when picturing a blacksmith's day, but in medieval times, the law was an ever-present and sometimes terrifying force in a blacksmith's life. From guild regulations to criminal investigations, blacksmiths were often under scrutiny, and the consequences for failing to follow the rules could be harsh. First, consider the role of guilds. Blacksmiths were typically members of guilds, organized groups that controlled the trade within a town or region. Guilds were responsible for maintaining quality standards, regulating prices, and controlling who could practice the craft. While guilds provided a community and a degree of protection for their members, they also enforced strict rules. Break a guild rule, and you could face fines, public shaming, or even expulsion, which could ruin your career. The fear of guild punishment meant blacksmiths had to work not only hard, but also perfectly, no room for error or shortcuts. Moreover, guilds often had a powerful influence over local authorities, which means blacksmiths were also subject to the laws of the land. In some cases, blacksmiths were tasked with creating instruments of justice like shackles or execution tools, making them closely linked to the enforcement of law. But if a blacksmith was suspected of failing to meet standards, or worse, selling faulty weapons, they could be investigated by local officials. The consequences could be dire: heavy fines, imprisonment, or loss of the right to practice their trade. Historians still debate how frequently blacksmiths were persecuted or punished under medieval laws. Some believe that guilds protected their members fiercely, making punishments rare except for serious offenses. Others suggest that blacksmiths were vulnerable to exploitation and could be targeted unfairly because of the powerful nature of their craft. Either way, the fact remains that blacksmiths lived under the shadow of legal consequences, and the fear of punishment was a constant companion. In addition to guild rules and legal threats, blacksmiths also had to navigate the complicated world of taxes and fees. Medieval blacksmiths were often required to pay taxes on their goods, and these could be substantial. Failure to pay taxes or fees could result in severe penalties, including confiscation of tools or shop closure. For a blacksmith, losing their tools wasn't just an inconvenience. It meant losing their ability to work, and often losing their livelihood. The financial pressure from taxes added yet another terrifying element to their already difficult lives. Blacksmiths also had to contend with the danger of theft and vandalism. Because blacksmiths dealt in valuable metals and craft sought-after weapons and tools, their workshops were often targets for thieves. Moreover, in times of political unrest, blacksmith shops could be targeted for raids or attacks, especially if the blacksmith was perceived to support one faction or another. This external danger extended to the blacksmith's family and apprentices. The blacksmith's home was often near or attached to the workshop, meaning any attack on the shop could also put their loved ones at risk. In a world where violence was not uncommon, the blacksmith's family lived with the constant fear that their home could be targeted. There's also the moral dilemma blacksmiths faced. As the makers of weapons, blacksmiths played a direct role in warfare and violence. Many medieval blacksmiths might have struggled with the knowledge that their hands created tools of death and destruction. Some were deeply religious, grappling with the ethical implications of their work. Yet, refusing to make weapons wasn't always an option. The blacksmith was bound by economic necessity and social expectation to provide the materials needed for war and defense. This conflict added an emotional and spiritual weight to the blacksmith's terrifying life. Historians still argue about the degree to which blacksmiths felt guilt or responsibility for the weapons they made. Some think blacksmiths viewed their work as a necessary service. Tools were just tools, and it was the wielder who bore the moral responsibility. Others believe that some blacksmiths were deeply troubled by their role in the violence of the time. In conclusion, the medieval blacksmith's life was terrifying, not only because of the physical dangers and mental pressures, but also due to the complex web of legal, social, and moral challenges they faced. Despite these challenges, medieval blacksmiths persevered, creating the tools and weapons that shaped history, often at great personal cost. Their terrifying profession was one of skill, endurance, and constant vigilance, both against the dangers of the forge and the pressures of the world beyond. Now that we've covered the physical, mental, legal, and emotional toll of being a medieval blacksmith, let's take a step back and look at something else that makes this profession truly terrifying: the blacksmith's role in society and their complex relationship with power. Blacksmiths were responsible for creating some of the most important tools of war and social control, and with that came a heavy sense of power and the fear that came with wielding it. Consider this: medieval blacksmiths weren't just people who made tools and weapons for everyday use. They were also responsible for crafting the weapons of war. Swords, axes, spears, and armor. These were the tools that determined the fate of kingdoms and rulers. Blacksmiths were responsible for shaping the very instruments of power that dictated who lived and who died in battle. The weight of that responsibility could be terrifying. If you were a blacksmith, your creations could influence the outcome of wars, and your work might literally change the course of history. There was no escape from that power. Your sword might help a kingdom conquer an enemy, or it might betray a warrior on the battlefield, leading to death. The pressure of knowing that your craft could be the difference between victory and defeat would haunt any blacksmith. But it wasn't just about warfare. Blacksmiths were also deeply tied to social order. Medieval societies were structured hierarchically, and blacksmiths played a role in maintaining that structure. They were often relied upon by the wealthy and powerful, including nobles, knights, and soldiers, who needed weapons, armor, and tools. To be a blacksmith was to be tied to the powerful institutions at the time, and that carried with it both privileges and perils. The relationship with nobility could be one of patronage, but it also meant that blacksmiths could be called upon to create weapons or tools for the defense of the powerful. whether they wanted to or not. The blacksmith was connected to political power. Their work could directly influence the balance of power in medieval society. But what about the fear that comes with wielding such influence? The blacksmith, as someone who crafted weapons and tools for powerful individuals, often found themselves in a precarious position. If their creations were used to oppress, conquer, or destroy, the blacksmith could be seen as complicit in that violence. Imagine the terror of knowing that your weapons might be used for unspeakable purposes, yet not being able to escape your role in society. In times of political unrest, blacksmiths could find themselves at the mercy of whoever held the power. They might be forced to create weapons for a regime they didn't agree with, or might face retribution from a rival faction. The role of the blacksmith was further complicated by their relationship with religion. In medieval times, religion was deeply woven into every aspect of daily life, including the work of blacksmiths. Blacksmiths were often seen as having godlike abilities, with some believing that their ability to manipulate fire and metal was a divine gift. But this connection to divinity also had its darker side. The church sometimes considered blacksmiths' work as dangerous or even sinful. The act of creating weapons for war or armor to oppress peasants could be viewed with suspicion by religious authorities. Imagine being a blacksmith who was responsible for creating tools used to crush uprisings or subjugate the poor. How did that sit with your conscience, especially if you held religious beliefs that valued peace and love? The pressure of reconciling these conflicting forces, religion and craft, must have been deeply unsettling. Historians still debate whether blacksmiths experienced moral conflict as a result of their work with weapons. Some argue that the blacksmith's profession was seen as neutral, a simple craft for making necessary tools. Others believe that blacksmiths, particularly those working in war-torn areas, struggled with their role in creating instruments of violence. The choice to forge weapons for war could have been both a pragmatic decision and a psychological burden. In the face of all this, blacksmiths had to find a way to survive both physically and emotionally. Many blacksmiths simply accepted their role in society, choosing to focus on the craft itself rather than dwelling on the consequences of their work. But others likely faced deep personal turmoil, torn between their duty as a craftsman and the unsettling implications of what their creations could be used for. How many blacksmiths suffered from guilt, knowing that their work might be part of the tools of oppression or violence? How many were able to justify their work as a means of survival or a necessary evil? Another terrifying aspect of blacksmithing was the isolation it often entailed. A blacksmith didn't just create tools and weapons, they also kept secrets. Blacksmiths often worked alone or with just a few apprentices, leaving them isolated in their workshops. This loneliness was compounded by the weight of their work, the pressure to meet orders, and the constant danger of the forge. Historians still argue about the social and psychological effects of working in such isolation. Some suggest blacksmiths were more likely to experience mental health issues, such as anxiety or depression. Others suggest blacksmiths found a kind of solace in their work and accepted the solitude, knowing that their craft was essential. However, whether they found comfort or felt trapped, one thing is clear. Blacksmiths were often forced to reconcile their role as creators of weapons with their place in a society filled with violence and war. As the blacksmith hammered away, shaping metal and forging the weapons that would define the future, the knowledge that their work had such a profound impact on the world would have been a constant, terrifying reality. They were shaping history, but they were also bearing the weight of its consequences. As we dig deeper into the terrifying life of a medieval blacksmith, another crucial aspect of their terrifying job is their relationship with the elements, specifically the unpredictable nature of fire and metal. The forge was a blacksmith's kingdom, but it was also a domain full of chaos and danger, especially when things didn't go according to plan. Imagine standing in front of a blast furnace or an open forge, controlling fire that could reach temperatures well above 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it could be life-threatening. Blacksmiths had to control the fire with their knowledge of airflow, fuel, and timing, but one slip could cause disastrous consequences. A sudden flare-up of fire, A gust of wind that directed flames where they shouldn't be, or a faulty piece of equipment could set the entire shop ablaze in seconds. Many blacksmiths were injured or even killed by accidental fires in their own forges. The risk was always there, lingering like an invisible predator ready to strike at any moment. There were no fire departments to rush to the rescue. If a forge caught fire, it was up to the blacksmith and their apprentices to extinguish it before it engulfed the entire workshop. This relationship with fire was both necessary and terrifying. Without the forge, the blacksmith couldn't do their work. But the forge was also a beast wild, uncontrollable, and dangerous. The risk of explosion was also ever present. The blacksmith didn't just deal with heat and flames. They often worked with highly volatile materials like coal, charcoal, and various metal ores that could be unstable in the wrong conditions. If these materials weren't handled carefully, they could ignite or even explode, causing massive damage and putting the blacksmith's life in immediate danger. There were also the metal fumes to contend with. While blacksmithing, blacksmiths were exposed to the toxic fumes produced by burning metal. These fumes could cause respiratory problems, and prolonged exposure could lead to chronic lung diseases. In some cases, inhaling these fumes could even kill. One of the most dangerous substances was lead, which could be found in many of the materials used in metalworking. This led to a condition known as lead poisoning, which could cause nausea, headaches, and neurological damage over time. But blacksmiths didn't just work with metals. They also worked with chemicals like acid to clean and treat metal. The toxicity of these chemicals made blacksmithing all the more hazardous to health. It's hard to imagine, but for a blacksmith, these risks were part of their daily life. It was as if danger was woven into the very fabric of their profession. Heat, toxins, and the ever-present fear of explosions and fires made the blacksmith's job far more terrifying than it might seem on the surface. Despite all the risks, blacksmiths still had to perform and perform well. The pressure to work fast and efficiently, while also avoiding injury and maintaining the quality of their craft, was immense. The sense of responsibility weighed heavily on them, knowing that the products they created could be used for good or for destruction. In an era of constant warfare and conflict, their work could mean the difference between victory and defeat, life and death. Historians still argue how much the blacksmith's understanding of fire and metalworking shaped medieval society. Some argue that the craft was sacred, as it required a level of knowledge and control over one of nature's most powerful elements. Others suggest that blacksmiths were revered for their practical knowledge. They were the ones who kept communities functioning by producing the weapons and tools necessary for survival. Regardless of how society viewed them, the reality was clear. Blacksmithing was not just an art or a craft, it was an extremely dangerous and terrifying job. Now, let's talk about one more aspect that made blacksmithing so terrifying: the constant pressure to adapt to the needs of a rapidly changing world. As the medieval period progressed, wars became larger, and the demands on blacksmiths became greater. The technology of warfare changed rapidly, with new types of weapons and armor requiring more advanced techniques. This meant that blacksmiths had to continually learn new skills, develop new tools, and keep up with the latest trends in military technology. If a blacksmith couldn't keep up, they risked losing customers, their status, and ultimately, their livelihood. The blacksmith's craft was always evolving. For example, the advent of plate armor in the 14th century required blacksmiths to develop new methods for shaping and hardening steel. The introduction of crossbows and firearms meant blacksmiths had to adapt to the changing needs of warriors and armies. If they failed to adapt, they could be left behind, struggling to meet the demands of a rapidly modernizing world. Historians debate how much these technological advancements were a burden or a boon for blacksmiths. Were they excited by the possibilities of new weapons and techniques, or did they fear the extra pressure to innovate? Did they feel like they were constantly racing to stay ahead, or did they see these changes as a natural part of their work? Some believe that the changing demands on blacksmiths increased their stress and fear they were never allowed to relax. They were constantly on the edge, having to evolve with the times or face being forgotten by the community. So, the blacksmith's terrifying world wasn't just about the physical dangers or the mental strain of their work. It was also about the fear of obsolescence, the pressure to adapt, and the ever-present spectre of change. It wasn't enough to simply survive day by day. Blacksmiths had to thrive in a world that constantly tested their limits. Now, let's dive into another terrifying element of the medieval blacksmith's life: the unpredictability of their customers. As much as the blacksmith worked in their forge, their craft was still subject to the whims of those who needed their products. And it wasn't just about meeting orders on time. It was about meeting expectations, and often, those expectations were unreasonable. Blacksmiths were critical members of medieval society, and their work could be the difference between life and death in battle, between a successful harvest and a ruined crop. And yet, the clients they served were often impatient, demanding, and sometimes even downright unreasonable. Whether it was a knight needing a sword or a farmer requiring a plough, blacksmiths had to meet demands for precision, speed, and quality all at once. Medieval knights, in particular, were often the most demanding clients. They needed armor and weapons that could stand up to battle, but their expectations often didn't line up with what the blacksmith could provide in terms of time and resources. In some cases, knights would arrive with extremely tight deadlines, demanding that their armor or swords be made immediately, without consideration for the time and effort needed to craft the perfect piece. If a blacksmith couldn't meet the deadline, they risked not only losing the job, but also the knight's favor, and in a world where social and political power were deeply tied to the military elite, that could be a disastrous blow. The pressure on blacksmiths didn't stop there. The general public, too, had high expectations. A blacksmith's reputation was built on quality and timeliness, and failure could ruin their livelihood. Historians still debate how precarious the relationship between blacksmiths and their clients really was. Some suggest that blacksmiths were highly respected figures in their communities, with loyal customers who understood the effort required to produce high-quality products. Others argue that unrealistic expectations and poor treatment were the norm, no matter the client's status. In addition to dealing with individual customers, blacksmiths also had to cope with the demands of larger institutions. Town leaders or the church might place large orders for tools, swords, or armor, all of which had to be delivered on time and according to strict specifications. These larger clients were often highly demanding and wielded significant political and social power. A blacksmith who failed to meet these demands could find themselves ostracized or even punished. The fear of failure weighed heavily on every blacksmith's mind, as they balanced the needs of individual clients with the expectations of higher authorities. Despite these constant pressures, blacksmiths also had to remain polite and professional in their dealings. There was no room for argument or disagreement with clients. If a customer wasn't satisfied, a blacksmith had little choice but to apologize, make amends, and repair any mistakes or risk losing business altogether. Even if the demands were unfair or impossible, the blacksmith's livelihood depended on the client's satisfaction. Discontent or complaints could lead to disastrous consequences, especially in a world where word of mouth could make or break a business. But let's not forget the backbreaking work involved in crafting these pieces under such pressure. Imagine spending days or even weeks shaping a piece of armor or forging a sword, knowing that one tiny mistake could lead to failure. The mental strain of producing flawless work while under the constant watch of demanding customers could have been overwhelming. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths were seen as cultural heroes, trusted figures who could meet the demands of society, or whether they were simply exploited workers under constant stress. Some believe blacksmiths were respected for their skill, while others suggest that their work was undervalued and treated as just another trade. Regardless of how they were perceived, one thing is certain: the pressure to meet customer expectations was an ongoing source of stress and fear for medieval blacksmiths. In the end, the unpredictability of the job facing demanding, sometimes unreasonable customers was just another terrifying aspect of being a medieval blacksmith. It wasn't just about working with fire and metal, it was about dealing with the constant pressure to meet the needs of a society, that relied heavily on the blacksmith's ability to deliver the goods, no matter the cost to the craftsman's body, mind, or spirit. The terrifying world of the medieval blacksmith wasn't just confined to the pressures of their work or the looming risk of injury and failure, it was also about their relationship with warfare, which shaped so much of their existence. Blacksmiths were more than craftsmen. They were crucial players in the war machine, responsible for creating weapons and armor that would determine the fate of battles and the survival of empires. Every medieval blacksmith knew that their work could end up in the hands of warriors, kings or soldiers, making their tools a key part of the ongoing struggle for power and control. The weapons they forged, swords, shields, axes, and armor, weren't just tools. They were symbols of power, violence, and dominance. The blacksmith's craft was integral to the very fabric of war, which, in medieval society, was ever present. Imagine the fear of knowing that your work could be used to wage destruction. Weapons of war weren't just functional. They were often designed to be as effective and deadly as possible, which meant blacksmiths had to push the limits of their craft, experimenting with materials, designs, and techniques to create the most efficient killing machines. Medieval blacksmiths faced the terrifying prospect of creating weapons that could destroy kingdoms, weapons that could turn the tide of a battle or even lead to the downfall of an entire civilization. Swords weren't just tools, they were symbols of kingship and authority. To make a weapon of war wasn't just about the physical labor, it was about understanding the psychology behind warfare. The weight of honor that rested on the blacksmith's hands was incredible. That the product they forged could be the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat. The art of war deeply influenced the blacksmith's craft. With the rise of knighthood and the importance of personal combat, the demand for highly specialized, exceptional weapons was great. Blacksmiths were expected to forge swords that would not only be sharp and strong, but also aesthetically pleasing weapons that spoke to the warrior's status. This demanded a level of precision and skill that was nearly unmatched in any other craft. The swords, shields, and armor created by blacksmiths were often highly decorated, bearing the symbols of noble houses, religious imagery, and intricate engravings that made them look like works of art as well as instruments of war. Historians still debate whether the artistic nature of these weapons was just for display or if it played a psychological role in warfare. Some argue that the aesthetic beauty of a well-crafted sword could inspire the warrior wielding it, boosting their morale and confidence. After all, the sword was more than just a weapon, it was a personal companion on the battlefield, a symbol of a knight's honor and prestige. But what about the practical side of things? Was the artwork just a side effect of making the weapon, or did it genuinely enhance its function in battle? Some scholars believe that the decoration of the sword could weaken the steel or affect its balance, while others argue that the skill required to forge such beautifully intricate weapons could improve the overall craftsmanship and strength of the blade. But despite the artistic flair, the true terror of blacksmithing lay in the dangerous weapons that blacksmiths were called upon to create. Imagine the pressure to forge weapons for war, knowing they would be used to kill. The blacksmith couldn't escape the moral responsibility of their work. Every sword forged, every suit of armor completed, had the potential to be used in battles that could change the course of history. Blacksmiths weren't just shaping metal, they were shaping destiny, and with that came a heavy burden. The blacksmith's role in creating armor also meant they had to keep up with the constantly evolving military tactics and technologies of the time. As the nature of warfare changed from close combat with swords to the introduction of long-range weapons like crossbows and firearms, blacksmiths had to adjust their designs. Armor, once made to withstand swords and axes, now needed to be strong enough to resist bolts and arrows, and later, the impact of gunfire. The evolving demands of military technology meant that blacksmiths had to constantly innovate and experiment with different materials from steel to iron, and even leather and chainmail to create armor that could provide the necessary protection for soldiers and knights. Blacksmiths were also tasked with creating siege weapons, tools of destruction designed to bring down castles and fortifications. The pressure of designing and building these massive weapons was enormous. These weren't just tools, they were instruments of destruction, capable of bringing down the walls of a castle or city in a single blow. The catapults, ballista, and battering rams built by blacksmiths were critical to the success of sieges, and the blacksmith's role in their design and construction was essential. Imagine the pressure of creating a weapon that could destroy a castle, knowing that its success or failure could determine the fate of a kingdom. The blacksmith had to carefully balance strength, functionality, and precision to ensure that these weapons were capable of doing their job when the time came. And what happened if a blacksmith failed? Imagine forging a sword that breaks in battle or a piece of armor that doesn't hold up. The consequences were grave, and the blacksmith could find themselves facing the wrath of those who relied on their work. Not only could they lose customers, but they could also be blamed for the death or injury of soldiers and knights who depended on their products to survive on the battlefield. Historians still argue about the moral dilemma blacksmiths faced in their work with weapons. Was it possible to be a peaceful craftsman while forging the tools of war? Did blacksmiths feel a sense of guilt for creating the instruments of violence that fueled so much conflict? Or did they simply see their work as a necessary evil, a way to survive in a world that was defined by war and power? We may never know for sure, but what's clear is that the blacksmiths' connection to warfare made their job far more terrifying than we might realize. They were not just makers of weapons, they were shapers of history, whose craft played a key role in the rise and fall of empires. As we've explored the intensity, the physical risks, and the emotional burden of being a medieval blacksmith, it's time to focus on one more aspect that made their profession especially terrifying: the constant evolution of weapons and armor in response to the shifting tides of warfare. Blacksmiths weren't just working with fire and metal, they were engaged in an ongoing battle of innovation and adaptation to keep up with new technologies, and their failure to do so could be disastrous. In a world where the nature of combat was constantly evolving, blacksmiths had to be constantly on their toes. Early medieval battlefields were dominated by swords, spears, and shields, and a blacksmith could expect to be crafting these weapons in high demand. But as warfare evolved, so did the tools of war, and blacksmiths had to be prepared to adapt to the new demands. One of the most significant changes came with the rise of long-range weapons, such as the crossbow and the longbow. The introduction of these weapons shifted the balance of power on the battlefield, and blacksmiths had to quickly develop armor that could protect against the new threats. The emergence of plate armor was one of the most significant technological shifts in the medieval period. Plate armor, designed to protect the wearer from blunt force and cutting blows, required advanced forging techniques and stronger metals. For blacksmiths, the task of forging plate armor was monumental. They had to master the art of shaping large sheets of metal and then assemble them into complex pieces of protective gear. Plate armor wasn't just about protecting the body, it was about creating a complete system that could protect every part of a soldier's body, from the head to the feet. Creating these intricate pieces demanded incredible craftsmanship and precision, but it also required blacksmiths to work with heavier materials and greater complexity than ever before. However, the evolution of armor didn't stop at plate mail. As siege warfare progressed, blacksmiths had to design armor capable of withstanding the new weapons of destruction, such as crossbows and early firearms. The rise of these gunpowder weapons marked a new chapter in medieval warfare, and blacksmiths had to adapt quickly. Firearms brought with them the need for reinforced armor, and blacksmiths faced the terrifying challenge of crafting armor that could withstand gunfire, a feat that many could not accomplish. The development of these new technologies required blacksmiths to stay ahead of the curve, always experimenting with new materials and techniques to stay relevant in an increasingly dangerous world. Blacksmiths were also tasked with creating siege weapons, tools of destruction designed to bring down castles and fortifications. The pressure of designing and building these massive weapons was enormous. These weren't just tools, they were instruments of destruction, capable of bringing down the walls of a castle or city in a single blow. The catapults, ballista, and battering rams built by blacksmiths were critical to the success of sieges. Imagine the pressure of creating a weapon that could destroy a castle, knowing that its success or failure could determine the fate of a kingdom. The blacksmith had to carefully balance strength, functionality, and precision to ensure that these weapons were capable of doing their job when the time came. And what happened if a blacksmith failed? Imagine forging a sword that breaks in battle or a piece of armor that doesn't hold up. The consequences were grave, and the blacksmith could find themselves facing the wrath of those who relied on their work. Not only could they lose customers, but they could also be blamed for the death or injury of soldiers and knights who depended on their products to survive on the battlefield. Historians still argue about the moral dilemma blacksmiths faced in their work with weapons. Was it possible to be a peaceful craftsman while forging the tools of war? Did blacksmiths feel a sense of guilt for creating the instruments of violence that fueled so much conflict? Or did they simply see their work as a necessary evil, a way to survive in a world that was defined by war and power? We may never know for sure, but what's clear is that the blacksmiths' connection to warfare made their job far more terrifying than we might realize. They were not just makers of weapons, they were shapers of history, whose craft played a key role in the rise and fall of empires. Blacksmiths, therefore, were constantly in a state of uncertainty and danger. Whether it was the fear of injury, the moral burden of their work, the ever-evolving technology of war, or the pressures of keeping up with customers and demand, medieval blacksmiths lived on the edge. Their work could shape the destiny of kings or bring about death and destruction, but the fear they carried every day was just as crucial to their profession as the steel they forged. As we come to the final chapter of this journey through the terrifying life of a medieval blacksmith, it's time to reflect on the legacy of the blacksmith's craft, and how the fear and hardship of their profession have shaped our world today. The blacksmith's role in society, while fraught with danger, pressure, and ethical dilemmas, was also crucial in shaping the course of history, from the creation of legendary swords to the weapons that influenced the outcome of wars and the rise and fall of empires. The legacy of the blacksmith extends far beyond their ability to craft beautiful, functional weapons. Blacksmithing, as a craft, was a linchpin in the medieval world, connecting everything from warfare to society. In medieval towns and villages, blacksmiths were often the heart of the community, as they provided essential tools for survival, from farm implements to tools for building and even everyday items like nails and horseshoes. But more than that, blacksmiths were the creators of power. Their craft determined the fate of nations and individuals alike. As we've seen, the pressure they faced was not only physical but emotional and moral. They worked under extreme conditions, constantly navigating the balance between creation and destruction, innovation and tradition, and survival and sacrifice. However, despite the terror that came with the craft, blacksmiths were undoubtedly essential to medieval society. Their ability to forge weapons for war and tools for peace made them an integral part of the social fabric. The evolution of the craft over centuries has contributed to the modern world we live in today. The tools, weapons, and technologies developed by blacksmiths laid the foundation for much of the Industrial Revolution. The same forging techniques that blacksmiths used in medieval times would eventually evolve into the advanced technologies of the modern steel industry. Even today, blacksmithing holds an important place in the arts and trades, with blacksmithing schools and craftsmen continuing to pass on the techniques of the past. While it's no longer the life or death trade it once was, the legacy of the blacksmith is still alive, and their craft remains a reminder of how far human ingenuity and resilience have carried us. The very metalwork that was once forged to protect the realm or to shape the fate of kingdoms now lives on in smaller, more artistic forms, from decorative ironwork to functional tools. Blacksmithing was once the foundation of society, and though it's changed, it has never really gone away. Despite the terror of their work, blacksmiths were, in many ways, the silent architects of civilization, shaping not just metal, but history itself. Without them, the armies that fought to define nations would not have had their weapons. The fortresses that stood against invasions would not have had the armor to protect them. The roads, tools, and farming implements that built civilizations would have been absent. Blacksmiths were central to empire building, but they also bore the weight of that empire's wars. conquests, and conflicts. The medieval blacksmith's life was defined by a constant state of fear and danger, a relentless battle against both the elements and the expectations of society. The work was exhausting and sometimes dangerous, but it was also essential. It was a life lived under immense pressure, constantly adapting to the needs of a world that demanded both beauty and brutality from its craftsmen. The consequences of failure were grave, and the moral and emotional toll was enormous. Yet, the blacksmith persevered, knowing that their work would not only shape the physical world around them, but also leave a lasting imprint on history. In the end, the life of a medieval blacksmith was a paradoxical profession that was at once terrifying and essential. They were the creators of life and death, the makers of weapons and tools, and the silent warriors of civilization. They lived in the crucible of fire, metal, and moral conflict, shaping the course of history with every strike of their hammer. The next time you admire a piece of metalwork, whether it's a decorative item, a tool, or even a piece of historical armor, remember the blacksmith who once shaped it, and the terrifying reality of the life they led. In their own way, the medieval blacksmiths have shaped our modern world, though we may no longer hear the clanging of their hammers or feel the intense heat of their forges. Their legacy lives on in the tools and technologies that make our lives possible today. As we wind down tonight, think of the brave men and women of the past who shaped the world from fire and metal, from conflict and creation. Let the quiet rhythm of their craft carry you into a peaceful rest, knowing that the terrifying and powerful nature of their work shaped not just their own time, but every moment since. As you reflect on the terrifying yet essential life of the medieval blacksmith, you can appreciate the resilience and strength that permeated their craft, even in the face of constant fear and danger. Much like the blacksmiths of old, we too face challenges, but with each obstacle, we grow stronger. Now, as you lie back and let the peaceful silence of the night settle in, take a deep breath and allow yourself to rest. The legacy of those who shaped history with their hands reminds us that even in the most difficult of times, we can endure and forge our own path. Good night and sweet dreams.